She was just an ordinary hotel receptionist, until that fateful rainy night when a convoy of sleek black SUVs pulled up in front, and the man who stepped out nearly made her heart stop. 6 years ago, he was the love of her life. 6 years ago, she eloped in the night, carrying a secret he never knew. Now the city's most powerful crime boss stands right in front of her, and their 6-year-old son sleeps less than 10 miles away. If you want to know what happens next, hit like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed, and don't take your eyes off the screen. The rain had been falling since 7 in the evening, and by 10 it was the kind of rain that made the city feel like it was trying to erase itself. Rowan Hale stood behind the front desk of the Alderton Grand and watched water streak down the glass entrance doors in long silver threads. The lobby was quiet. A Tuesday night in mid-November usually meant half-occupied floors and a skeleton crew, and tonight was no exception. The concierge, a soft-spoken man named Fletcher, had gone on a smoke break 20 minutes ago and hadn't come back. The bellman on shift was somewhere in the parking structure. It was just Rowan and the sound of rain and the low hum of the heating system pushing warm air through vents that needed cleaning. She picked up the reservation sheet she'd already reviewed twice and looked at it again. Suite 1201. Corporate booking. Arriving late. That was all the notation said. No name attached to the reservation, just a company designation she didn't recognize and a note from the hotel's general manager, Patterson, that had been paperclipped to the printout that morning. Priority guest. Full discretion. Rowan handles check-in personally. She'd asked Patterson what that meant. He'd said, "It means you smile, you hand over the key card, and you don't ask questions." Then he'd left for a dinner he clearly didn't want to miss. Rowan tucked the sheet back under the desk and rolled her shoulders. Her feet hurt. They always hurt by 10 o'clock. 8 hours at the Alderton, then a 4-hour dinner rush at Carver's Diner across town, then back here for the overnight check-in shift because the regular overnight clerk had called out sick and she needed the hours. She needed the hours the way she needed oxygen, not because she wanted them, but because without them something essential would stop. Eli's daycare bill was 3 weeks past due. The check engine light on her car had been on since September. There was a leak in the ceiling of their apartment above the bedroom closet, and the landlord had stopped returning calls. She pressed her palm flat against the desk and stared at the entrance. The rain came harder, then headlights swept across the lobby floor. Not one set, several. Rowan frowned and leaned forward slightly. Through the streaked glass, she could make out the shapes of vehicles pulling up in sequence along the hotel's circular drive. Not taxis, not ride shares, but large, dark SUVs with tinted windows, pulling in tight formation the way she'd only ever seen in movies, and once, years ago, outside a courthouse she'd had no business being near. The lead vehicle stopped directly at the entrance. The others fanned out, 2 angling toward the side approach, 1 hanging back at the street. Doors opened. Men stepped out wearing dark clothing, and for a moment they simply stood there in the rain, scanning the exterior of the building with the kind of practiced patience that had nothing to do with waiting for the weather to ease. They didn't carry umbrellas. The rain didn't seem to bother them. Then the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Rowan watched a man step out. He wasn't the largest man in the group. Some of his security detail had 6 inches and 50 pounds on him, but he was the one who changed the atmosphere. You felt it before you understood it. The way the others moved around him, the way they organized themselves without words, the way the entire arrangement of bodies in the rain rotated slightly in his direction the moment he stood upright. He wore a dark coat, open at the collar despite the cold. His hair was shorter than she remembered. His jaw was harder. 6 years of whatever his life had become had settled into the lines of his face and changed them into something more severe than what she'd loved, but the way he moved hadn't changed at all. Rowan Hale felt the blood leave her face. Her hands, which had been resting flat on the desk surface, curled into fists at her sides. No. The word formed inside her chest without reaching her mouth. No, no, no. The entrance doors slid open. Dominic Varela walked into the lobby of the Alderton Grand, and the first thing he did was look directly at the front desk. His eyes found her immediately. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The men who had entered behind him stopped at the edges of the lobby, stationing themselves without being told. One went toward the elevator bank. One drifted toward the side corridor. The rest spread out with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times in many different rooms. Dominic walked toward the desk. His stride was unhurried. That was what she'd always remembered most, the way he moved through space like time had agreed to accommodate him. It had charmed her once, a long time ago, when she'd been younger and far more foolish about what certain kinds of confidence actually meant. She made herself breathe, made herself look down at the keyboard for half a second, just to break the locked eye contact, just to remind herself that she was Rowan Hale, night shift receptionist, single mother, woman who had remade herself from scratch in this city and had managed 6 years without this conversation. He stopped at the desk. "Dominic Varela," he said. "Checking in." His voice was the same, lower, maybe, rougher at the edges, but the same. "Of course, she said. Her voice came out level. She would never fully understand how. She pulled up the reservation on screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard without shaking. Suite 1201, 2 weeks tentative, corporate rate, all incidentals prepaid. She typed. She found the keycard sleeve. She pressed the cards against the encoder and waited for the beep. He hadn't looked away from her face. "You look different," he said. "It's been a long night." She kept her eyes on the screen. "Suite 1201, elevator bank, is to your Rowan." The way he said her name stopped her cold. Not loud, not sharp. Just the one word, said the way you say something when you've been carrying it for a long time and have finally found somewhere to set it down. She made herself look at him. "I'll need a card for incidentals," she said. "Even with a prepaid booking, hotel policy requires—" "You disappeared," he said. 6 years ago. I woke up and you were gone. No note, no number. Nothing." 2 guests exiting the elevator glanced toward the desk as they passed through the lobby. Rowan smiled at them with a smile she kept in a separate compartment from the rest of herself. The smile she used for hotel work and diner work and every other part of her life that required her to look like someone who was fine. The guests went through the doors. "The card, Mr. Varela," she said. Something moved across his expression, not anger, closer to recognition, like she'd just confirmed something he'd been calculating since he stepped through the door. He reached into his coat, withdrew a black card, and slid it across the desk. She processed it without looking at the name embossed on its surface, though she'd have been lying if she said she hadn't felt the edge of it against her fingertips. "Your suite is on the 12th floor," she said. "The key cards are already coded. Breakfast service begins at 6:30. If you need anything this evening, the desk is staffed until—" "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Have a good night, Mr. Varela." She held out the keycard sleeve. Her hand did not shake. She was proud of that, and she hated that she was proud of it. He took the cards, but he didn't move. "I'm going to be staying a while," he said. "We'll talk." It wasn't a question. He'd never been good at questions. That was something she'd forgotten until this exact moment, the way statements just fell out of him with the weight of things already decided. "Housekeeping begins at 8, she said. "Good night." He held her gaze for another moment, and then he turned and walked toward the elevator bank, and his men assembled around him like a current finding its natural shape, and the lobby swallowed them all in the quiet mechanical slide of elevator doors closing. Rowan stood at the desk. The rain hit the glass. She pressed both hands flat against the desk surface and breathed through her nose until the shaking she'd suppressed for the last 4 minutes finally reached her hands, and she let it happen because no one was watching. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out. A text from the woman who watched Eli overnight when Rowan worked late shifts, a retired neighbor named Sable who lived in the apartment directly below them and had taken to the boy with a warmth Rowan didn't deserve and was endlessly grateful for. "He asked for you again before he went down. I told him you were working hard. He said okay. He's asleep now. Don't worry." Rowan stared at the text until the words blurred slightly. Then she put the phone away, straightened her shoulders, and went back to work. She did not sleep that night. By Wednesday morning, Dominic had been in the hotel for 12 hours and had already rearranged the 12th floor to suit his operation. 2 rooms adjacent to the suite had been booked by members of his team, The booking had come through at 2 in the morning via a separate corporate account. Fletcher, who'd finally returned from his smoke break to find the night completely transformed, had pulled Rowan aside near the staff entrance and asked her in a low voice whether she wanted him to stay on past his shift. She'd told him she was fine. He hadn't believed her, but he'd gone home anyway because he had 2 kids of his own and a mortgage, and wasn't paid enough to insert himself into situations he didn't understand. Rowan understood the situation perfectly. That was the problem. She understood that Dominic Varela ran the largest criminal syndicate operating in the northeastern corridor of the country. She understood that his organization moved money through a network of legitimate businesses, real estate, private security, logistics, while maintaining a parallel structure underneath that was responsible for things she'd spent 6 years trying not to think about. She understood that the men positioned in the lobby and at the side entrance and in the parking structure were not there for show. She also understood that she had a 6-year-old son with his eyes and his jaw and his particular way of tilting his head when he was listening to something that interested him, and that Dominic Varela did not know this, and that every hour he remained in this hotel was another hour in which that fact could change. She'd left because she was pregnant and terrified, and because she had watched, from the edges of his world, what happened to the people Dominic loved. His younger brother had been killed when Dominic was 26, a targeted attack by a rival faction that had sent a message with brutal clarity. An associate of his who'd been close to him, a man named Trent, had been found in the harbor. These were not isolated incidents. They were the pattern. They were the cost of proximity to power like his, and Rowan had been 3 months pregnant when she'd finally understood, bone deep and irreversible, that she could not let her child inherit that cost. So she'd gone. In the night, without a word, because she'd known that if she tried to explain, he would have argued, and he would have been persuasive, and she might have stayed. And staying might have eventually meant watching her child grow up afraid, or not grow up at all. She'd built a life here quietly. She was good at quiet. She just hadn't anticipated that his life and her life would occupy the same building. He came to the desk at 11 that morning while she was transferring her shift notes to the day clerk. She saw him coming across the lobby and took 2 controlled breaths and didn't turn around. "I'd like a car arranged," he said, tinted, "for 2 o'clock." Of course. The day clerk, a young man named Price, was right there. She could have handed this off. She didn't, because stepping away from the desk would look like flight. "I'll have the concierge, and I'd like to speak with you," he said, "when you have a minute." "I'm finishing a shift transfer, Mr. Varela, so after then." Price was looking between them with the uncomfortable awareness of someone watching a conversation he wasn't supposed to understand. Rowan handed him the shift report and smiled with the professional warmth she'd spent years calibrating and said, "Give me 5 minutes." She walked Dominic to the small seating area near the window alcove, away from the desk, away from the concierge station, away from anyone who might be paying too much attention. The morning light came through the window at a low angle. Outside, the city was wet and gray from last night's rain. "You're not going to make this easy," he said. "There's nothing to make easy. You're a guest. I'm hotel staff. You know what I mean." "I know what you want me to mean." She sat across from him and kept her posture straight. "I left. It was a long time ago. We were not married. We were not engaged. We had been together for less than a year. People end relationships, Dominic. They don't owe explanations for every one of them." "You weren't ending a relationship," he said. "You were ending a life. You were ending a phone number and a face and a city. You didn't just leave me. You left everything." She looked at him. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it that she recognized. The particular way he looked when he was working to keep something compressed that wanted to surface. "I needed a change," she said. 6 years, Rowan. People change cities. You faked your address. Your phone was disconnected within 24 hours. I had people try to find you. The admission landed between them. She held still. "That's not comforting information," she said. "I know." He looked out the window, his jaw tightened. "It wasn't my best moment." "Did you find me?" He turned back to look at her. "No." She didn't let herself feel any particular way about that. "So here we are." "Here we are." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "I'm not here to cause problems. I have business in the city for the next week, possibly 2. I didn't choose this hotel because of you. I didn't know you were here." She believed him. That was the worst part. She believed him completely, because if he'd known, the convoy would have arrived differently. There would have been something planned in his face rather than that raw, barely contained disorientation she'd seen when he'd walked through the door last night and found her standing at the desk. "Then let's agree that we are adults," she said, "who share a building for a short period of time and proceed accordingly. And if I don't agree with that, you'll find I'm very good at my job, Mr. Varela." She stood. He watched her stand. "You look tired," he said. The bluntness of it, the lack of cruelty or kindness in it, just observation, just the thing he'd noticed said plainly, nearly undid something she'd spent the whole morning reinforcing. "I work 2 jobs," she said. She went back to the desk. But you don't. The next 3 days had their own terrible rhythm. He was not in her face constantly. That would have been easier, in a way, easier to maintain the posture of professional distance against something that remained at a fixed pitch. Instead, he was intermittent. He was present in the lobby at 9 in the morning when she was doing room assignment reviews. He was at the hotel bar at 8 in the evening with 3 of his men, and she walked past on her way to the service corridor and felt his attention track her across the room without turning to confirm it. He called the front desk once to ask about late checkout protocol for one of his team's adjacent rooms, and she recognized his voice in the first syllable and answered his question in 12 words and ended the call. He was watching her, not intrusively, not threateningly. In the particular way of a man who has a question he already knows the shape of and is collecting evidence to confirm it. She began varying her route through the lobby. On Friday morning, Sable texted to say Eli had a half day from school and was asking if maybe Mama could pick him up at noon and take him to see the waterfront. Rowan's chest ached. She texted back that she'd try to arrange it, knowing she couldn't, knowing her Friday shift ran until 3, and the Alderton didn't do flexible cutoffs. She was in the middle of rerouting a group reservation when she heard Eli's voice. Her head came up so fast she felt the vertebrae in her neck protest. He was at the entrance. Sable had brought him. Rare, almost unheard of. Sable, who understood with no explanation that the hotel was a compartment Rowan kept entirely separate from her home life. But there Sable was, holding Eli's hand, her expression apologetic and slightly harried. And there Eli was, 6 years old with his dark eyes and his too serious face and his small, insistent self. "Mama said she was here," Eli told Sable with complete confidence. Rowan came around the desk before she'd consciously decided to. "Hey," she said, crouching to his level. "What happened? I thought—" "Half day," Eli said. "Sable forgot you were working." "I did not forget," Sable said, which was clearly untrue. Rowan pressed her hand briefly to Eli's cheek. He was warm from having been outside in the cold, the particular warmth that happened when a child ran around and then came in from the wind. His hair needed cutting. She'd been meaning to take him for 2 weeks. "I can't leave yet, baby," she said. 2 more hours. Sable's going to— "Can I wait here?" "This isn't really a place for—" "I'll sit somewhere," he said. "I'll be quiet." She looked at him. He had the look he got when he'd already decided something and was now patiently waiting for her to catch up. She didn't know where he'd gotten that look. It was not from her. "Okay," she said. "The chair's by the window. You don't move from there. You don't talk to guests." "Okay." She set him up in the alcove with his backpack and the tablet she kept in her locker for emergencies. Sable gave her an apologetic squeeze on the shoulder and left. Rowan went back to the desk. She worked, she answered calls, she processed a room upgrade. She did not look at the alcove more than once every few minutes. At 12:40, she looked up from a check-in and saw Dominic standing at the edge of the lobby. Not at the desk. Not approaching her. Standing near the elevator bank, stopped, looking toward the window alcove with an expression she could not interpret from across the room. Rowan followed his eyeline. Eli was sitting in the chair with his tablet, feet not reaching the floor, headphones halfway on the way they always were when he was half listening to something and half thinking about something else. He had his head tilted to one side. Dominic's jaw had gone rigid. His entire body had gone still in the way of someone whose internal processing has just outpaced their ability to respond. Rowan was around the desk and across the lobby in under 15 seconds. She stepped directly between them. Dominic. Her voice was low. Don't. He looked at her. His eyes were not angry. That was what scared her. They were something far more complicated than angry. How old is he? Dominic said. It wasn't a question. That was the thing. The way the words came out, it wasn't really a question at all. Please, she said. Not here. How old is he, Rowan? Eli looked up from his tablet. He saw his mother. He saw the tall man standing behind her. He did what 6-year-olds do when they sense tension in a room. He went very still and very watchful, that animal instinct for danger calibrating quickly and quietly behind those familiar dark eyes. Rowan turned to her son. Eli, she said, keeping her voice even, go with Price to the staff break room. Tell him Mama sent you. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Eli looked at the man behind her one more time. Then he slid off the chair, picked up his bag, and walked toward the desk without arguing. Rowan turned back to Dominic. We are not doing this here, she said. Then when? Not in the middle of my lobby, in front of my staff, in front of my... She stopped. His expression shifted. Say it, he said. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. The calculation that moved across his face was something she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself and failing. It wasn't shock. It wasn't grief. It was something more foundational. The look of a man whose entire understanding of the last 6 years has just collapsed and is being replaced in real time by something he doesn't yet have a name for. Tell me, he said, very quietly, that I'm wrong. The lobby stretched out around them. The heating system hummed. Rain was starting again against the windows. Rowan looked at him, and she said nothing, which was the only answer that mattered, and they both knew it, and the silence between them landed like a door being broken down. Not a door that had been locked, but a door that had been held shut by 6 years of sheer will and distance, and the particular terror of a woman who had made a choice she believed was right, and had lived every day since wondering if it was. Dominic took one step back, then another. He wasn't retreating. He was giving himself room to contain what was happening inside him, and he was barely managing it. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. Then again. He reached in and looked at the screen. Something crossed his face. Not about her, not about the boy, something external, something from the world he actually ran, and his expression shifted into a different register entirely. We're not done, he said. I know. He looked toward the window where Eli had been sitting. The chair was empty now. He looked at it for 3 long seconds. Then his phone buzzed a 3rd time, and one of his men materialized from somewhere near the corridor and said, in a low voice, 2 words Rowan didn't catch, and Dominic straightened, his coat settling back around him. The man she'd glimpsed for 30 seconds receding behind something harder and more practiced. He turned and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Rowan stood in the middle of the lobby and did not allow herself to breathe too deeply until the elevator doors had closed. Then she went to find her son. She didn't know yet that outside the hotel, on the street diagonal to the entrance, a man in a parked gray sedan had been watching the building for the last 4 hours. Didn't know that he'd photographed the convoy when it arrived 3 days ago. Didn't know that the photograph of Dominic Varela stepping out of the lead vehicle had already been transmitted to someone who would spend the next 24 hours deciding what to do with that information. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that Eli was in the staff break room eating crackers from his backpack, and that Dominic Varela was 12 floors above her head, and that the wall she had spent 6 years constructing between those 2 facts had just developed a crack she didn't know how to repair. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the particular grief of someone who had always known this moment would come eventually, was a sound she didn't want to hear. The sound of something that had been sealed shut beginning, against her will, to open. Eli was eating crackers one at a time, methodically, the way he did everything, with a patience that was almost unsettling in a child his age. He had his tablet propped against a coffee mug someone had left on the break room table, and he was watching something with the sound low, his headphones crooked on his head, one ear covered and one not. He looked up when Rowan came in. You okay? He asked. 6 years old, and he asked her that. She didn't know when he'd started doing that, reading the room, reading her, but it had been happening for a while now, this quiet alertness he carried, this habit of checking. "I'm good," she said. She sat in the chair across from him and reached out and straightened his headphones properly over both ears. "Give me 10 minutes and we'll get out of here, okay? I'll find someone to cover the last hour." He nodded and went back to his tablet. She sat there for a moment longer than she needed to, just watching him. The particular angle of his jaw when he was concentrating, the way his brow pulled slightly inward, the dark eyes that had always belonged to someone else and that she had spent 6 years learning to see as simply his, simply Eli's, because he was his own person and she had never wanted him to be a reminder of anything. The problem was that she was not the only one doing the looking anymore. She found Price and told him she needed to leave by 1. He said fine. She went to her locker and changed out of her uniform blazer and stood in front of the metal door with her coat half on, breathing. Then she took her son home. She didn't sleep Friday night. She lay on her back in the dark with the ceiling above her and her mind running the same loop it had been running since 12:40 in the afternoon, since she'd stood in the lobby and not answered his question and watched him understand anyway. The thing about Dominic Varela was that he was not stupid. He had never been stupid. Charming, yes, and dangerous, and occasionally capable of a tenderness that had made her believe for almost a year that the world she'd been warned about would remain at enough distance to be livable. But underneath all of that was a mind that processed information the way a machine processed it, fast, without sentiment, storing conclusions. He'd done the math the moment he saw Eli. She knew that. She had always known that a face-to-face encounter, if it ever came, would last exactly as long as it took him to look at the boy and calculate the years. What she hadn't anticipated was the way his face had looked in that moment. Not the anger she'd prepared for. Not the cold fury of a powerful man who'd been deceived. Something rawer than that. Something she didn't have clean language for because she'd built her entire exit strategy on the assumption that he would be enraged, and that rage would confirm everything she'd believed when she left. He hadn't been enraged. He'd looked like something had been taken from him. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stared at the ceiling and told herself it didn't matter what he'd looked like. Saturday morning, she dropped Eli at Sable's, drove to the Alderton, and parked in the staff lot with the engine running for 4 minutes before she got out of the car. He was waiting in the lobby, not at the desk, not in the seating area. He was standing near the window that overlooked the side street, hands in his coat pockets, and he turned when she came through the staff entrance with the particular efficiency of someone who had been watching that door. She walked to the desk, set down her bag, clocked in. Price was finishing his overnight notes. She exchanged 4 sentences with him about a guest complaint on the 9th floor and a broken ice machine on 7, and felt Dominic's attention the entire time, a weight she could physically locate, sitting between her shoulder blades. Price left. She turned around. He crossed the lobby. He stopped at the desk. He didn't say good morning. "Tell me his name," he said. "Dominic." His name. She looked at him. His face was composed, but his eyes had that particular flatness of someone who has not slept and has been thinking without stopping for 16 hours straight. "Eli," she said. Something moved across his expression. He absorbed it. "Eli," he repeated. "Yes." "And He stopped. She watched him recalculate, not the years, he'd already done that, but something else. The weight of the word, the reality of a name attached to the abstraction he'd been carrying through the night. "He's 5, she said, "almost 6. His last name. Hale." His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything about that. He looked at the surface of the desk between them. "I want to talk," he said. "Not here. Not like this. Somewhere that isn't a hotel lobby. I'm working. You get a break." "Not for 2 hours. Then I'll wait." She looked at him. "That's not a conversation I'm ready to have." "I don't think readiness is the point anymore, Rowan." "The point," she said, keeping her voice low and flat, "is that I have a job, and I am doing it, and I would appreciate it if you didn't stand at my desk for the next 2 hours making my staff uncomfortable." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Room 1201, when you're ready." and he turned and walked to the elevator. She watched him go. Then she picked up the phone receiver, set it down without dialing anything, and went to fix the 9th floor complaint. Oh, she went up at 11:15. The 12th floor had a different atmosphere from the rest of the hotel. Quieter, the carpet thicker, the lighting slightly warmer. Also, there were 2 men in the corridor who registered her arrival without making eye contact, their posture shifting in that small, unconscious way that meant they'd clocked her and made a decision about her in under 2 seconds. She knocked on the suite door. Dominic opened it himself. He'd changed since the lobby. Still a dark shirt, but his coat was gone, sleeves pushed back at the forearms. He looked less assembled, more like the version of him she'd known, before she'd understood what the assembled version meant. She walked in. The suite was large and had been rearranged since check-in. The coffee table pushed aside. A second monitor set up near the desk, documents she carefully didn't look at covering half the available surfaces. One of his men was in the corner with a laptop, and Dominic said something short in a low voice, and the man closed the laptop and left through the connecting door. They were alone. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He didn't argue. He sat on the edge of the couch and looked up at her and said, "How long did you know?" "Before I left." "Before you left?" He repeated it without emphasis. "So you knew when you left?" "Yes." "You've known for 6 years?" "Yes." "And you decided—" He stopped. He pressed his thumb against the inside of his opposite wrist, a gesture she recognized from years ago, something he did when he was forcing himself to stay controlled. "You decided I didn't need to know. I decided that knowing would put him in danger." "That's not your decision to make." "It absolutely is." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, harder than the professional composure she'd been maintaining all week, and she let it. "I watched what happened to the people around you, Dominic. I watched what your life cost. I was 3 months pregnant, and I had seen enough to understand exactly what it would mean to raise a child inside the radius of everything you were building. You didn't know what I was building. I knew what it was made of." He stood. Not aggressively. He stood and turned away from her toward the window, and for a moment he was just a man standing in front of glass with his back to her and his hands at his sides. "You should have told me," he said. "You would have asked me to stay." "Yes." "And you would have told me you could protect us." Silence. "Could you have?" she asked. He didn't answer. "There it is," she said. He turned around. His face was controlled, but the control was effortful in a way she could see. "I'm not the same as I was 6 years ago," he said. "I know that too." "Do you?" "You're more careful, more powerful, better protected." She held his gaze. "That doesn't mean the danger went away. It means the danger got more sophisticated." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I have a son." The way he said it was an accusation. It was something he was saying out loud for the first time, as if the act of saying it made it real in a way that all the internal calculation hadn't. She felt the impact of it somewhere she'd tried to seal off. "Yes," she said. "And he doesn't know. He knows his father isn't in the picture." She kept her voice even. "He's never asked more than that." Dominic absorbed this. His expression did something complicated and then went still. "I want to meet him," he said. "No. Rowan, we're not there. You don't get to decide that unilaterally. Not anymore. You made a unilateral decision 6 years ago, and I'm telling you—" He stopped, recalibrated. When he continued, his voice had dropped back down to something more controlled. "I'm telling you that I'm not disappearing. I'm here. I know. And we are going to find a way through this that doesn't involve you managing the situation like I'm a risk you're mitigating. That's exactly what you are." The words came out before she'd weighed them, and she watched them land, watched his expression absorb the impact, and didn't apologize because she'd meant them, and they both knew it. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the lobby the day before, not with anger, but with that more complicated thing she kept failing to name. "Do you trust me at all?" he said. "Still, after everything." "That's not the question." It's exactly the question. The question, she said, is whether I trust the situation. And I don't. And I won't until I understand why you're here in this city and how long you're staying and what's actually happening around you right now, because I'm not naive, Dominic. That convoy didn't show up at my hotel because everything in your world is calm. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a faction, separate from my organization. They've been pushing into territory we control for about 8 months. I'm here to resolve it. Resolve it. Diplomatically, if possible." She looked at him. "If not," he said, and didn't finish. She let out a slow breath. "And they know you're here. It's likely, which means they know where you're staying. My security is thorough. Your security is 12 men in a hotel that has 4 separate public entrances and 260 rooms." She crossed her arms. "I know this building, Dominic. I know every corridor and every service exit and every blind spot in the camera system. Your security is not as thorough as you think it is." He studied her. Something shifted in his expression. Not new information, but information being weighted differently. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've spent every hour since Wednesday night thinking about nothing else." He was quiet. Outside, the city moved in its Saturday morning rhythm, indifferent to the 12th floor and everything happening inside it. "I need a few days," he said finally, "to handle what I came here to handle. After that," he paused. "After that, I want to talk about what comes next, for him, for—" He stopped again. "I'm not asking you to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen. I'm asking for a conversation that doesn't happen across a hotel desk." She looked at him for a long moment. "A few days?" she said. "Yes. And then we talk about Eli, about what you want and what I'll allow and what the lines are going to be. Fair. Those are my terms." "I know." She turned toward the door. "Rowan." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me his name." She opened the door and went back to work. Sunday passed without incident, which made her more anxious, not less. Dominic was in and out of the hotel in organized movements. Departures in the late morning, returns before dinner, his team distributed around him with the practiced nonchalance of men who were very good at not looking like what they were. She watched the rhythm of it from the desk and the corridor and once from the window of the linen storage room on the 3rd floor, where she'd gone ostensibly to do a supply count, and had stood instead watching a black SUV idle outside the entrance for 7 minutes before pulling away. Monday morning, Fletcher pulled her aside near the staff lockers. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked at him. "The guest's on 12, he said. "Are we okay?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's a man who's been sitting in a gray Nissan across the street since Friday. I mean, I've counted 3 different vehicles that parked in that block and left within an hour each time. I mean, Patterson has been getting phone calls in his office with the door closed." Fletcher was not a dramatic man. He said these things in a low, methodical voice, like a man itemizing something he wasn't sure he wanted to know the full sum of. "I mean, I've worked in hotels for 11 years, and I know what it looks like when a building has a target on it." Rowan breathed. "Call Patterson," she said. "Patterson's not going to—" "Call him and tell him what you told me. Exactly what you told me." She held Fletcher's gaze. "And if he doesn't respond appropriately, I'll handle it." "Handle it how?" "I'll handle it, Fletcher." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and went to find Patterson. Rowan went back to the desk and picked up her phone and looked at the number she'd stored in her contacts under a false name on Saturday morning after she'd come down from the 12th floor. The number she'd gotten from the hotel's booking confirmation because it was the only number she had for him. She typed, "The gray Nissan across the street." "How long has it been there?" The response came in under 90 seconds. "Since Thursday." She stared at the screen. Thursday. He'd known since Thursday and hadn't. Another message. "I didn't want to alarm you." She typed back, "You should have told me." A pause. Then, "Yes, I should have." She set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the entrance doors, and thought about Fletcher's itemized list and the gray sedan and the 8 months of territorial pressure Dominic had described in the suite on Saturday, and she thought about the blind spots in the camera system that she knew, and his security team didn't. And she thought about Eli at Sable's 3 miles away, eating whatever Sable made on Monday mornings, and watching cartoons with complete ignorance of every single thing happening in this building. The phone buzzed again. Additional security arriving this afternoon. It's being managed. She picked the phone up and typed back 4 words. It's not enough, Dominic. She didn't hear back, but 40 minutes later, when she went to retrieve a package from the side entrance, she noticed that the gray Nissan was gone from across the street and had been replaced by a black sedan she didn't recognize, with 2 occupants visible through the windshield. She stood in the side doorway and looked at it. Not his men. She couldn't say how she knew that. The stillness of the vehicle, the angle of it, something in the way it was positioned that was different from the disciplined formation of Dominic's team. His people moved. They rotated. They didn't sit with the particular settled quality of a surveillance position that was in for the long term. She went inside and called the number. He picked up on the second ring. The car that replaced the Nissan, she said without preamble. Black sedan, 2 occupants, street side of the north entrance. A pause. 3 seconds. Go to your office, he said. Lock the door. I'm at the front. Rowan? His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. Go to your office right now. She heard something in the background. A short exchange in voices she didn't recognize, terse, moving. She heard a door. What's happening? She said. The car is not ours, he said. Do what I said. She was already moving down the corridor. How long have they been? Office, lock it. Do not open it until I call you directly. Dominic, Eli is at Sable's? Her blood went cold. Yes. Why are you? Stay on the line, he said. And then he was talking to someone else, rapid and low, and she was in the corridor behind the desk, moving toward the small manager's office that had a lock that worked, and her hands were steady because fear, when it hit a certain level, had a way of clarifying everything down to the next immediate action. She got into the office. She turned the lock. Through the door, she could hear the lobby. Normal sounds, check-in at the desk, elevator chime, the background hum of a functioning hotel on a Monday morning. Through the phone, she could hear men moving fast. Talk to me, she said. We've had eyes on 2 of their people since this morning, Dominic said. We thought they were watching the exterior. They're not. A pause. Another short exchange in the background. They're watching exits. The implication settled over her like cold water. They're going to move, she said. Not here, he said. Too public. But they know my patterns now. They know I've been here 6 days. Another pause, longer. They may know more than that. She thought about Thursday. The gray Nissan since Thursday. Eli coming to the hotel on Friday afternoon with Sable. Eli sitting in the window alcove where anyone outside with a long lens could have. Dominic, she said. I know, he said, and the quietness of it told her he'd already thought it through and arrived at the same place she had. You need to get him, she said. You need to get Eli out of... I have 2 people going to Sable's address right now. He's fine. He's going to stay fine. He doesn't know those people. They'll tell Sable that Eli's mother sent them. You can call Sable right now and confirm it. She was already pulling the phone from her ear to open her messages. Then she stopped. How do you know Sable's address? She said. Silence. Dominic. I had someone look into your situation when I recognized you Wednesday night, he said. Background, standard. I needed to know. You investigated me. Her voice came out flat. You had someone run my life. I needed to understand my son's babysitter's home address. Each word careful and separate. Standard. Rowan right now is not. When we're done with this, she said, you and I are going to have a very different conversation than the one we planned. Agreed. No argument, no deflection, just the one word, and something underneath it that acknowledged he'd earned the response she was giving him. Call Sable, tell her the men are safe. I'll have Eli somewhere secure within the hour. Where? Here. This floor. He'll be with my people. He'll be terrified. Tell Sable to tell him his mother asked them to bring him somewhere safe and that she'll call him in 20 minutes. She pressed her hand against the door. And me? She said. Stay where you are until I come to you personally. Not my people. Me. And if something goes wrong before, nothing is going to go wrong. That's not an answer. No, he said, it's not. A pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed in some way she couldn't fully characterize. Lower, something stripped out of it. I'm coming to you, that's my answer, she called Sable. She explained in 30 seconds that 2 men were coming and they were safe and trusted and Eli needed to go with them. And Sable, who was a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the specific tone of voice that meant you didn't ask questions, said yes, and that she'd have his bag ready. Rowan sat on the edge of the manager's desk in the locked office and held her phone in both hands and waited. Outside the door, the hotel went on being a hotel. The elevator, the desk calls, the distant sound of a cart being wheeled across marble. She thought about the charity gala that Patterson had been organizing for the past 3 weeks. The annual fundraiser the Alderton hosted every November, already 60% booked, scheduled for Thursday evening. The ballroom. 200 guests. Catering, a live orchestra, the kind of event that filled the lobby and spilled into every corridor and made the building feel temporarily like a different place. Thursday. 4 days. She was still thinking about it when the knock came at the office door and Dominic's voice came through, steady and immediate. It's me. She opened the door. He was there with 2 of his men behind him, and his expression had the focused quality of someone in the middle of managing multiple things simultaneously, but his eyes came straight to her face and did a quick inventory, checking. Eli's on his way up, he said. She exhaled. The 2 men in the sedan? Relocated. He said it in a way that foreclosed follow-up questions, and she let it. Thursday, she said. The charity event. 200 people in the ballroom. Patterson won't cancel it. He looked at her. Your people are going to be in this building until Thursday at the earliest, she said. Whoever is watching from that car is going to still be watching. You put 200 civilians in this building Thursday night and something goes wrong. I know. You can't let it... Rowan. He stopped her. I know. I'm already working on it. He held her gaze. Trust me on this one thing. She looked at him. At the face she'd run from 6 years ago and the face that had looked at Eli's empty chair and done the arithmetic and gone still in a way she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. I'm going to see my son, she said. Yes, he said. Come on. She followed him down the corridor toward the elevator, and the doors slid open, and as they stepped inside, she caught her reflection in the metal panel opposite, tired, precise, holding something together by increments, and thought about the charity gala and the gray sedan and the men repositioning outside the building and the fact that Dominic Varela was standing 8 inches to her left with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and she was no longer choosing the terms of this situation. The situation had already chosen her. The elevator rose. And somewhere in the building, in the ballroom that was being decorated for Thursday's event, a member of the catering staff that Patterson had hired 3 weeks ago was adjusting a floral arrangement near the east wall and had, in the last 4 minutes, memorized the precise location of every emergency exit. Eli was sitting on the couch in the suite's second room with his backpack between his feet and his tablet in his lap. And when Rowan came through the door, he looked up with the particular expression he used when he was trying to decide whether to be scared or not, like he was waiting for her face to tell him which one was appropriate. She crossed the room and sat beside him and put her arm around him and felt the small, solid reality of him settle against her side. Hey, she said. The men were nice, he said. One of them knew a card trick. That's good. Sable gave me a sandwich. He held up a foil-wrapped square. She said, don't eat it in the car, but I didn't. Good. He leaned his head against her shoulder and was quiet for a moment, and she pressed her lips briefly against the top of his head and stared at the far wall and breathed. From the main room, she could hear Dominic's voice, low and continuous, and the occasional short response from one of his men. She could hear the particular efficiency of people coordinating something urgent, not panic, nothing as loose as panic, but the tight, purposeful rhythm of a response already in motion. Mama? Eli said. Yeah. Is something wrong? She looked down at him. His eyes were on her face, the same inventory she'd seen Dominic do 30 minutes ago in the corridor, the same searching quality, and it was so precise a resemblance that it moved through her like a physical thing. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said. "Okay," he said, which meant he didn't believe her and had decided not to push it. He went back to his tablet. She sat with him for 11 minutes. Then she got up and went into the main room. Dominic was at the desk near the window with his phone and a printed map of the surrounding blocks that someone had produced from somewhere. 2 of his men were with him. A third was at the suite door. The room had the concentrated atmosphere of a command post that had been improvised from hotel furniture. He looked up when she came in. "He's all right?" he said. "He's eating a sandwich." Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softness exactly, more like a pressure changing. He looked back at the map. "Talk to me about the building's layout," he said. "Service corridors, camera blind spots. You said you knew them." She moved to the desk. She looked at the map. It was a city block diagram, not a building schematic, but close enough. She oriented herself. "Service corridor runs the length of the east side," she said. "Ground floor. Connects the kitchen to the loading dock, to the laundry, to the maintenance bay. Cameras cover the kitchen entrance and the loading dock, but there's a 40-foot gap in between where the old freight elevator used to be. Converted to storage, the camera was never reinstalled." He looked at the man beside him, who wrote something. "Second floor," she continued. "Staff stairwell B is not on the main security monitor. It was added during a renovation 3 years ago, and no one ever updated the panel assignments. I reported it to Patterson twice. It's still not fixed." "Why'd you notice it?" She looked at him. "Because I work here." "Because when you work somewhere long enough, you learn all the ways it can go wrong." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. "The ballroom," he said. "Thursday." "What about it?" "Patterson won't cancel. I already had someone speak to him." His jaw tightened. He said canceling would expose the hotel to liability from deposits. He said he'd add extra door staff. "Extra door staff," she repeated. "Yes. Against people who put a trained operative in the catering crew 3 weeks before their operation." Dominic looked at her. "The catering company," she said. "Patterson hired them in October. Standard vendor, reputable. I've seen them work 2 events here, but 3 weeks ago he got a call from the company saying one of their regular staff had a family emergency and they were sending a replacement." She watched his expression. "I did the intake on the replacement. Standard credential check, everything cleared. But I've been running events in this hotel for 4 years, and the way he moved through the ballroom during setup yesterday wasn't the way catering staff move. He was mapping it." The room was very quiet. "Name?" Dominic said. "On file is Marcus Webb, but the original Webb checked in sick the same week your convoy arrived." Dominic turned to the man on his left and said 2 words. The man left through the connecting door. "You sat on this," Dominic said, turning back to her. Not accusatory, just precise. "I noticed it yesterday. I've been sitting on a lot of things trying to figure out which ones were my problem and which ones were yours." She held his gaze. "They're becoming the same problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We need to move Eli." "Where?" "I have a location outside the city. 40 minutes. Secure, staffed, no connection to my organization's known properties. He's not going anywhere without me. If you stay in this building through Thursday, then I stay in this building through Thursday," she said. "Figure out the other thing." He looked at her. "I'm not sending my son to a location I've never seen with people he doesn't know," she said. "That's not something I'm going to do." A pause. Something moved through his expression. Not argument, but recalibration. "All right," he said. "Then we do this differently." He looked at the map again. "I need you to walk me through every entrance and every blind spot in this building. All of it, tonight. My shift ends at 4. "Tonight," he said. "I'll be here." She went back to sit with Eli. But Tuesday came and went in a state of controlled acceleration that felt, from the inside, like being very calm at the top of a very long drop. Rowan worked her shift. She answered phone calls and processed checkouts and smiled at guests with the professional warmth she could produce on demand. And every 40 minutes or so, she found a reason to walk a corridor or check a supply room or step near a window that overlooked the street. She was cataloging. She did it with the same methodical patience she brought to inventory counts and shift reports, breaking the building down into segments and noting what had changed and what hadn't. The black sedan from Monday had not returned. That was not reassuring. Absence was not the same as withdrawal. The man registered as Marcus Webb showed up for Tuesday's catering prep in the ballroom at 10 in the morning. She saw him from the mezzanine, dark jacket, nondescript, moving with the slightly too deliberate pace of someone performing a role they'd practiced. She watched him for 90 seconds and then went back to the desk. She texted Dominic, "Webb is in the ballroom, 10 a.m. The response, "I know. Don't engage. Don't change your pattern." She thought about that. Don't change your pattern. And understood it as the instruction of someone who had lived inside this kind of situation long enough to know that the moment a target behaved differently, the people watching adjusted. She didn't change her pattern. At 2 in the afternoon, Patterson called her into his office. She sat across from his desk and looked at him, a compact, carefully dressed man in his mid-50s who had run this hotel for 9 years and who had, in Rowan's estimation, the particular blindness of someone who had never been in real danger and had therefore developed no instinct for detecting it. "The guest on 12, Patterson said. "Yes. I've received some calls." He folded his hands on the desk. "From parties I won't name, asking questions about our guest's schedule and movements." He paused. "I told them we don't share guest information." "Good. However," he looked at her, "I'm beginning to feel that this hotel has become involved in something that is significantly outside our operational scope." "Mr. Patterson, the charity gala is Thursday. I have the mayor's office attending. I have 3 major donors. I have a children's organization whose name is attached to this event." He leaned forward slightly. "I need Thursday to proceed without incident." "Then you need to cancel it," she said. "That is not an option." "Then you need to—" "What I need," he said, "is for you to tell me whether the situation on the 12th floor is going to produce an incident at my gala. Because if it is, I need to make decisions." She looked at him. She thought about how much to say. She thought about Marcus Webb in the ballroom and the sedan and the phone calls Patterson had just described. Parties I won't name. And she thought about 200 people in formal wear in the ballroom Thursday evening and the east wall in the service corridor. "I'm handling it," she said. Patterson studied her for a long moment. "You're handling it," he repeated. "Yes." "You're a night shift receptionist, Rowan. I'm also the person in this building who has the most complete picture of what's happening in it," she said. "And I'm telling you I'm handling it." He was quiet. Then he said, "I want a full security review of the ballroom before Thursday. I want the catering crew re-vetted. I want additional staff on every entrance." "I'll have it done by tomorrow afternoon," she said. She left his office and went directly to the stairwell and texted Dominic. "Patterson got calls about your schedule. He wants re-vetting of the catering crew." Dominic: "We pulled Webb's real ID an hour ago. His name is Carver Melee. He's worked for the Serrano faction for 4 years." She stopped on the landing. Serrano. She'd heard that name once, on a night she'd spent in the edges of Dominic's world before she'd understood enough to leave it. An organization that operated out of the coast with a reputation for the kind of violence that left messages. She typed, "What does that mean for Thursday?" A pause. Longer than usual. Then, "Come to the suite tonight. All of it needs to be on the table." She put Eli to bed at 8:30 in the suite's second bedroom, which had been cleared of work materials and furnished with the particular efficiency of men who'd produced a child-appropriate space from a hotel room in under an hour. Extra pillows, the tablet charger plugged in at the right height, the lights on the dimmest setting. Eli had questions about why they were sleeping at the hotel. She told him she was working a special project, and it was easier to stay close. He accepted this with the same patient skepticism he brought to most of her explanations and asked if he could watch one more episode of something before sleeping. And she said yes because it was Tuesday and he wasn't in school until Thursday, and because she needed him occupied and she needed to be in the next room. She sat at the table in the main room with Dominic and 2 of his senior men. One she'd learned was named Reyes, compact and gray-haired and with the kind of attention that missed very little, and one who went by Soto and spoke rarely but listened with complete focus. The Serrano faction's plan isn't to hit me Thursday, Dominic said. He had the map of the building spread on the table, the blind spots Rowan had identified marked in pen. That's not their style, and it's too public for what they want. Then what do they want? She said. Leverage. He looked at her. They've been watching this building since Thursday. They know my schedule. They know my team's positions. A pause. They photographed the lobby Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon. Eli in the window alcove. The tablet, the headphones, the small serious face pointed at the screen. They know about Eli, she said. It wasn't a question. We think so, Reyes said. She put her hands flat on the table. The surface was cool. Leverage, she said again. Serrano doesn't do straight confrontations, Dominic said. He creates positions where the other party has no viable move. He takes something. He waits. His jaw was tight. We've seen it twice in the last 8 months. Both times the targets made decisions they wouldn't otherwise have made because of who was being held. The room was quiet. He's going to take Eli, she said. Not if we move first. Move first? She looked at him. What does that mean? There's a meeting, Dominic said. Serrano wants one. He's been requesting through intermediaries since I arrived in the city. Neutral ground, neutral terms, discussion of territorial boundaries. He paused. I've been refusing. Why? Because Serrano's meetings don't end with territorial discussions. He looked at the map. But if I accept, if I go to him on his terms and bring Reyes and Soto and enough of my people, we draw his attention away from this building. And while his attention is here, it's not here, Dominic said. She thought about this. What happens at the meeting, she said. We negotiate. And if he doesn't want to negotiate? Dominic didn't answer. Dominic. Then we have a different conversation, he said, with different terms. She looked at Reyes. He was looking at the map. She looked at Soto. He was looking at his hands. She looked back at Dominic. You're going to a meeting with a man who wants leverage over you, she said, while the people protecting this building are reduced because your team is with you. The residual team here will be sufficient. You just told me Serrano photographs lobbies and plants operatives and catering crews 3 weeks in advance. You want me to trust that your residual team will be sufficient. I don't have a better option. Then we find one. There isn't one. There's always Rowan. His voice was quiet and it stopped her. I've been doing this for a long time. I know what the options are. I know what they cost. He looked at her across the table. I need you to trust me on Thursday. You need me to trust you with my son's life. Yes. The word landed in the room without apology or softness, just the fact of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the note she'd left 6 years ago, and the 3 months pregnant she'd been when she wrote it, and the specific calculation she'd made about trust and proximity and cost, and how certain she'd been, and how completely certain she'd remained for 6 years, and how the situation she was sitting inside right now compared to the situation she'd run from. It compared badly. It compared worse. Okay, she said. He held her gaze. Okay, she said again. Thursday. We do it your way. Wednesday passed. She worked. She put Eli in the suite with one of Dominic's men, a younger one named Cal, who had an easy manner with children, and who Eli, with his particular radar for genuineness, had decided within 20 minutes was acceptable. She walked her building. She checked the ballroom, checked the stairwells, checked the blind spot in the service corridor where the freight elevator used to be, and twice she stopped and stood in the middle of a corridor and thought about what she was doing. She was preparing a defensive position in a hotel she'd worked in for 4 years because a criminal organization was planning to use her son as leverage against his father, and his father was a man she'd run from when she was pregnant and terrified and convinced she was making the right choice. And the right choice had led here, to this exact corridor on a Wednesday afternoon with her hands steady and her mind very clear, and something that felt less like fear now and more like the particular coldness that comes when you've stripped everything down to what actually needs to happen. Wednesday night, she and Dominic sat in the suite after Eli was asleep, and they didn't talk about Thursday. They talked about other things, small things, initially. The hotel, a funny story about a guest complaint she'd handled, something Eli had said to Cal that had made the man genuinely laugh. And then larger things, incrementally, with the carefulness of two people handling something fragile and not entirely sure of the structural integrity. She told him about the first year, how she'd arrived in this city with $400 and a contact number for a women's resource program, and had slept in a single room above a dry cleaning shop for 3 months. How she'd gotten the diner job first. How Eli had been born in February during a snowstorm, and she'd been alone for it except for a nurse named Patricia who'd held her hand and talked to her about completely unrelated things to keep her focused, and she'd thought about that nurse more times than she could count in the years since. He was quiet while she talked. He didn't apologize or argue or interject. He listened with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which she'd once loved about him, and which still, after everything, landed the same way. He told her about the brother he'd lost, which she'd known about from a distance. He told her what it had actually been like. Not the aftermath, not the retaliation, not the structural changes in the organization that had followed, but the morning itself, the phone call, the drive across the city. He told her 3 sentences about it and then stopped. Not because he'd run out of words, but because 3 sentences was apparently all he had that he was willing to say out loud. She didn't push. They sat in the quiet of the suite with the city outside the window, and Eli asleep in the next room, and the weight of Thursday between them. And at some point after midnight she said she should try to sleep, and he said yes. At the door of the second bedroom she stopped. "If this goes wrong," she said, "it won't." "If it does?" He looked at her. "I've left instructions," she said, "with my building's manager, in an envelope. Sable knows it's there. If something happens to me, Rowan, let me finish." She held his gaze. "If something happens to me, there are instructions for Eli. Where to go. Who to contact. What he knows and doesn't know about his situation." She paused. "I've been keeping that envelope updated for 3 years, because I work 2 jobs, and I drive on icy roads in the winter, and I'm a single mother, and things happen. I'm telling you because you should know it exists." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, something compressed and precise and carrying more weight than it was showing. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." She went to sleep. What? Thursday arrived the way bad days sometimes do. Quietly, with good weather. The morning light came through the suite's east-facing windows at an angle that made the room look warmer than it was. Eli woke up early and ate cereal that Cal had produced from somewhere and watched an episode of something with the sound low, and Rowan stood in the shower for 4 minutes with the water as hot as it would go and thought through the day in sequence, mapping it against everything she knew. Dominic's meeting with Serrano was scheduled for 7 in the evening. Neutral location, a restaurant on the south side that had been pre-cleared by both parties' teams. He would take Reyes and Soto and 4 additional men. Cal and 2 others would remain at the hotel. The charity gala doors opened at 6:30. She'd done the math on that gap 3 times, and it still came out the same way each time. She dressed. She went into the main room. Dominic was already up, already suited, already running through something on his phone. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face. "You see it," he said. 6:30 and 7, she said. 30 minutes. "The gala guests will be in the ballroom. Eli stays on this floor. Cal is here." Cal is 1 person. 2 others. "Dominic, I know," he said. "I know the gap. I've been looking at it since 4 this morning." He set down his phone. "If I push the meeting to 8, Serrano interprets it as weakness and changes his position. If I move the gala, Patterson won't." "I know." She stood in the middle of the room. "I want to be in the building during the gap," she said. "You'll be needed for gala check-in. I'll do check-in, and then I'm on this floor. In fact, if something happens and you're on this floor, if something happens and I'm at the front desk, Eli is up here with 3 men he's known for 3 days." She held his gaze. "I'm on this floor during the gap. That's not a discussion." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." At 3 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Hale." The voice was even, unhurried, with a quality of complete control. I think we should speak before tonight becomes more complicated than it needs to be. Her chest went cold. You have the wrong number, she said. I have exactly the right number, the voice said. My name is Serrano. I believe you know why I'm calling. She said nothing. I want to reassure you, he said, in a tone that made reassurance sound like the least reassuring word she'd ever heard, that my interest is not in you. You are an uninvolved party. Uninvolved parties who cooperate tend to remain unharmed. What do you want? The meeting tonight, he said. I want it to proceed without interference. No additional security, no federal involvement, no surprises from Varela's side. A pause. If I feel the terms have been changed, I'll be forced to create new leverage, and I've already identified what that would look like. She gripped the phone. I don't have any involvement in Mr. Varela's. Ms. Hale, he said patiently. A woman with no involvement does not spend Tuesday evening walking the service corridors of her building with a flashlight, marking blind spots, while the subject's senior security personnel take notes. She had been watched on Tuesday, inside the building, the service corridor, the 40-foot gap where the camera wasn't. She'd been in that corridor and someone had been watching her, which meant the blind spot she'd identified wasn't a blind spot for them, which meant everything she'd told Dominic about the building's vulnerabilities had been information she'd given him while being observed, and the information about what she'd shared was now in Serrano's hands. The envelope of context she'd been building felt like it had just been turned inside out. Tonight proceeds as agreed, Serrano said. 7 o'clock. The terms stand. Varela comes to the table, no surprises. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make itself felt. And you keep your son on the 12th floor and don't do anything that forces me to be creative. The call ended. She stood in the service corridor, the same 40-foot stretch without a camera, and the phone was still in her hand and her breath was coming in and out at a rate she was conscious of because it was slightly faster than it should have been and she needed to regulate it. He knew about Eli. He knew she knew the building. He knew what she'd told Dominic. He had someone inside, not just Webb and the catering crew, not just the sedan outside. Someone who had been in the service corridor on Tuesday night watching a woman with a flashlight, and that person was still in this building. She walked back toward the elevator. She was halfway down the corridor when the door at the far end opened, and a man came through. Maintenance uniform, toolbox, face she'd seen twice before in the last week without registering, the particular unremarkability of someone who had been very careful to remain unremarkable. He looked at her. She looked at him. For 2 seconds, neither of them moved. Then he turned and went back through the door he'd come from, and she heard his footsteps accelerating on the other side, and she stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and understood that she had approximately 30 seconds before the shape of the evening changed irrevocably, because whoever he'd reported to was about to know that she'd just recognized him. And once that information moved, Thursday stopped being a plan and became not away from the door, toward the elevator, because running away from the door was the same as losing 30 seconds she didn't have. And 30 seconds was the entire margin between the shape of the evening staying manageable and becoming something she couldn't control from the outside. Her shoes hit the corridor floor and she was already pulling up Dominic's number before she reached the elevator bank, and the call connected on the second ring, and she said, without preamble, without breath management, "There's a second operative inside the building. Maintenance uniform. He just made me in the service corridor and he's running." A pause. 1 second. "Where are you?" "East corridor, ground floor. He went back through the door toward the loading dock." "Don't follow him. Get to the elevator. Come up now." "He's going to report that I spotted him and Serrano is going to—" "Rowan, elevator. Now." She hit the button. The doors opened. She got in. Her reflection in the metal panel looked back at her. The same image as 4 days ago, tired and precise and holding something together. Except 4 days ago she hadn't known about the second operative, and she hadn't been standing in a service corridor watching a man in a maintenance uniform make a decision about her in real time. The elevator rose. The doors opened on 12, and Cal was already in the corridor, which meant Dominic had been 2 steps ahead of her call, and Cal looked at her face and said nothing and moved aside to let her through. Dominic was on his phone when she came in. He held up one finger. Not dismissive, just the gesture of a man closing one line so he could open another. He said 3 words into the phone, waited, said 2 more, ended the call. "The man in maintenance," he said. "I've seen him twice this week. I didn't register him because he was always doing something plausible, changing a light fitting on Monday, checking a junction box Wednesday. He's not building maintenance. I know that now. His name is probably not on any list Patterson gave us." Dominic looked at Reyes. Reyes was already on his own phone, moving toward the window. Dominic looked back at her. "Serrano called you?" It wasn't a question. She'd told him in the corridor downstairs. "He wanted me to know he was watching," she said. "He wanted me to understand that anything I'd given you about the building, he already had. He wanted you scared." He succeeded partially. She looked at him. "He also told me the meeting stands, 7 o'clock, original terms. He said if anything changes, he creates new leverage, meaning Eli. He didn't use that word. He didn't need to." Dominic was quiet. He was doing the same thing he'd been doing since Monday. Running calculations, running variables, arriving at positions and testing them against the information. She could almost see the machinery of it behind his eyes, the particular focused stillness of a man who had been making high-cost decisions for a long time and had developed a physical relationship with the process. Then he said, "The meeting is off." Reyes looked up from his phone. "Dominic," she started, "if Serrano has a man inside this building who just got burned, the meeting was never about negotiation. It was a position. He wanted me out of the building at 7 with most of my team, so the inside man had a window." He looked at her. "You running into that man in the corridor wasn't bad luck. He let you see him." She absorbed this. "Why?" she said. "Because Serrano called you 3 hours before the meeting and told you to make sure I showed up. Then his man inside lets himself get spotted. You panic, you call me, I make decisions under pressure." His jaw set. "He's collapsing the timeline. He wants the chaos to start now, before the gala, before I've had time to reposition." "Or," Reyes said from the window, "the inside man made a genuine mistake and we're giving Serrano more credit than he deserves." "No," Rowan said. Both men looked at her. "I've managed events in this building for 4 years," she said. "I know how people move in it. That man moved like someone who'd been in that corridor many times. He wasn't checking a junction box. He was positioned. He was standing where the gap in the camera coverage is, the exact point." She looked at Dominic. He was guarding something or waiting for something. Another silence. Then Dominic moved to the desk and picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted mostly of him listening. When he ended it, his expression had changed, not visibly to most people, but she'd spent a week reading his face under pressure, and she caught it. The faint tightening around the eyes, the adjustment in the set of his shoulders. "What?" she said. "The loading dock," he said. "Cal checked it 10 minutes ago. One of the freight containers in the receiving bay isn't on the hotel's intake manifest." The room went very quiet. "How long has it been there?" she said. 2 days. She thought about Tuesday night, the service corridor, her flashlight, the systematic mapping of blind spots. All of it done while a freight container sat in the loading dock 2 days and none of them had thought to check the manifest. "Cal," Dominic said. Cal appeared in the doorway. "Get Eli up," Dominic said. "Dressed and ready to move. 5 minutes." Cal disappeared. Rowan was already moving toward the second bedroom. Eli came out of the bedroom with his backpack and his serious face and the expression of a child who has absorbed enough of the surrounding tension to know that this was not a 5 minutes until breakfast situation. He looked at Dominic. In 3 days, he'd accumulated a relationship with the man that Rowan had been unable to prevent, not because she hadn't tried to limit their exposure, but because Eli had a specific gravity when it came to adults who interested him. And Dominic had interested him from the first moment in a way that had nothing to do with knowing and everything to do with some instinct the boy carried in his bones. He'd started asking Cal questions about Dominic on Tuesday. Not personal questions, logistical ones. Does he always work this late? Does he always have this many people with him? Does he like this city? Cal had answered carefully. Eli had listened carefully. Now Eli stood in the main room of the suite with his backpack and looked at the man who was coordinating his evacuation from a hotel and said, in a voice that was very even for a 6-year-old, "Are we going somewhere?" "Yes," Dominic said. Is it safe? A pause. Brief, but there. Yes, Dominic said. Eli looked at him for another moment with those dark, evaluating eyes. Then he looked at Rowan. Okay, he said. She crossed to him and crouched and gripped his shoulders. You go with Cal. You do exactly what Cal says. You don't ask questions, you don't argue, you stay close. Where are you going? I'm dealing with something here. I'll be with you in Rowan. Dominic's voice, sharp and immediate. She stood up. The window. Reyes was at the window and something in his posture had changed. The specific compression of a man who has just seen something and is processing what it means. East entrance, Reyes said. 3 men. They're not ours. Dominic crossed to the window in 4 strides. Rowan stayed where she was, between Eli and the door, her hand finding Eli's shoulder behind her. How long? Dominic said. 40 seconds, maybe. They moved fast from the parking structure. The gala. Doors opened 8 minutes ago, Rowan said. There are guests in the lobby. Dominic turned. He looked at Reyes and something passed between them that had the compression of a full conversation conducted in under 2 seconds. Floor, Dominic said. Reyes was already moving. Dominic turned to Cal. Take him down stairwell B. Staff exit to the north side. Cars waiting. Do not use the elevator. Copy. Rowan, I'm not going with them, she said. Rowan, my building, she said. My blind spots. You need me here. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing again. The compression, the calculation, and underneath it, very briefly, something human and exposed that the situation kept producing in him and that he kept having to put away. Stay behind Reyes, he said. You don't go in front. You don't engage. You are eyes and direction only. Understood. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him. It lasted 2 seconds. It contained something Rowan couldn't translate and didn't try to. Go, Dominic said to Cal. Cal took Eli's hand and they went through the connecting door. Rowan followed Dominic into the corridor. The 12th floor to the lobby was 45 seconds in the elevator under normal circumstances. They took the main stairwell, which was not 45 seconds, and they took it fast, and by the time they hit the 8th floor landing, Rowan could hear something below them. Not gunshots, not yet, but the particular compressed disruption of a space that has had something wrong enter it. Voices raised, the sharp percussion of something falling. Ballroom or lobby, she said. Lobby first, Dominic said. They want me in the open. Don't give them the open. I'm not. He looked at her briefly as they moved. Side corridor to the service entrance. You know the route. Yes. Talk me through it. She moved ahead of him by 1 step, just one, just enough to be useful, and said, left at the bottom, past the linen cart storage. There's a junction where you can go left to the kitchen or right toward the ballroom service corridor. Right. They hit the ground floor. She turned left without breaking stride, and Reyes was behind them, and 2 of Dominic's other men materialized from somewhere, from the staging position she hadn't known they'd taken, falling in with the particular seamless efficiency she was still not entirely used to. The linen storage door was on her left, the junction ahead. She went right. The service corridor stretched in front of them, the same corridor she'd walked Tuesday night with a flashlight, the same 40-foot gap. Now it was lit and occupied. 2 of Serrano's men at the far end, one of them speaking into a radio, both of them registering the group coming down the corridor at the same moment Rowan registered them. Down, Reyes said. She dropped without deciding to, muscle following instruction before thought, and hit the corridor floor on her palms as the sound of the confrontation erupted above her. Not gunshots, impact, bodies in the narrow space, the grunt of someone taking a hit against the wall. She pressed herself against the baseboard and looked toward the far end and saw the corridor door swinging open and a 3rd man coming through. Rowan, door on your left. Dominic's voice, controlled and immediate, right above her. She looked. A door she knew. Maintenance storage. No camera. Accessible from inside. She got up and went through it. The room was dark. Shelving units, the smell of cleaning chemicals and the mechanical undertone of the HVAC system. She put her back against the shelving and breathed and listened to what was happening in the corridor, which was fast and brutal and mercifully brief. And then it was quieter. And then Dominic came through the door. He had a cut on his jaw, fresh, bleeding in the thin, controlled way of adrenaline-tightened vessels. 3 down, he said. But that was the corridor. The main group is in the lobby. How many in the main group? Reyes thinks 6, plus whoever else came through the east entrance. She did the building math. East entrance to the lobby was direct. No service corridor, straight through the side hall. 6 in the lobby plus 3 in the corridor meant Serrano had sent at minimum 9 people into the building, and that didn't count Webb in the ballroom, and it didn't count whoever had been in the freight container in the loading dock. The ballroom, she said. 200 guests. And Webb. Dominic looked at her. If the lobby is the distraction, she said, and the real pressure point is you, and they know you well enough to know you won't risk 200 civilians to protect yourself, then Webb in the ballroom is the lever. He doesn't have to do anything. He just has to be there. He just has to be a threat. Dominic's jaw tightened. Serrano told me to make sure you came to the meeting, she said. He said if the terms changed, he'd create new leverage. He wasn't talking about Eli. Eli was already being handled by the corridor operative. He was talking about the ballroom. He splits my attention. He makes you choose, lobby or ballroom, and whatever you choose, the other one costs you. He was very still for 3 seconds. Unless someone handles the ballroom independently, he said. She looked at him. Tell me the ballroom layout, he said. Every entrance, every exit, where the catering positions are. Dominic, talk. She talked. She'd run this building for 4 years, and the ballroom was her territory. She'd set up 43 events in it. She knew the table configuration for a seated gala of 200. She knew that the catering station was in the northeast corner and that the east wall had a service door that connected directly to the kitchen corridor and that there was a secondary exit behind the orchestra platform that most guests never noticed because it was dressed to match the wall paneling. He listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. The kitchen corridor exit, he said. That's where Webb will position himself if he wants a line to the loading dock. Yes. And if he's not planning to move until there's a signal from outside, he'll be at the catering station, she said, visible, doing his job, until the signal comes and the job changes. Dominic looked at her for a moment that was long enough to contain something neither of them said. Then he said, I need to get to the lobby. Reyes takes the ballroom. Reyes doesn't know that room. Rowan. He doesn't know where Webb will be, and he doesn't know the secondary exit, and he doesn't know that the northeast corner has an acoustic dead spot where you can't hear anything happening behind the orchestra. She held his gaze. I know all of that. I know it from 4 years of working every event in that room. If something happens to you in there, then you handle the lobby, and I handle the ballroom, and we stop splitting time arguing about it. He looked at her. The cut on his jaw was still bleeding, a slow dark line tracking toward his chin. You take Reyes, he said. He goes in first. You tell him where. Okay. You do not engage Webb directly. Okay. Rowan. I heard you. He reached out and gripped her arm for 1 second. Not hard, not possessive, just present, and let go. Then he turned and went back into the corridor. The ballroom in full gala configuration was its own universe. Crystal light, table linen in cream and gold, the orchestra on the raised platform at the west end playing something that belonged to a different kind of evening entirely. 200 people in formal wear, moving in the particular pattern of charity event guests, clustered at tables, drifting toward the bar, congregating near whoever in the room had the most gravitational pull. Rowan and Reyes came in through the wall panel exit behind the orchestra, which required a key she had on her ring, and which brought them into the ballroom at an angle that gave her a direct sight line to the northeast corner without crossing the floor. The catering station. White-jacketed staff. The mechanical service of a functioning event. She found Webb in 4 seconds. He was exactly where she'd said he'd be. At the station, plausible, doing something with a tray of glasses. But his weight was distributed wrong for the task. His attention was tracking the room in the specific pattern of a man maintaining awareness of every exit simultaneously. She put her hand on Reyes's arm and directed his attention with a slight pressure to the left. He saw Webb. His expression didn't change. She positioned them behind a column at the room's edge, out of Webb's sightline, and leaned close to Reyes and said in a voice below the orchestra, "The service door in the east wall is his exit route. If he moves, he goes there." Reyes nodded once. The orchestra played. The guests moved in their patterns. Webb stood at the catering station with his tray of glasses and his distributed weight and his eyes that never stopped moving. 30 seconds. 40. Rowan's pulse was a physical thing she could feel in the tips of her fingers and the back of her jaw. She pressed herself against the column and breathed through her nose and counted the exits and counted the guests near them and calculated the distance between Webb and the east wall service door and between herself and Webb and between Reyes and the angle he'd need to cut Webb off before that door. Her phone vibrated. She pulled it out. A text from an unknown number. Not Serrano's number, a different one. Check the loading dock. She looked at Reyes. He was watching Webb. She looked at the message. The boy didn't make it to the car. Her vision went white at the edges. She typed back with fingers that had stopped shaking only because she was pressing too hard. "Who is this?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "Someone who wants this evening to end cleanly." Cal was intercepted at the north exit. "The child is in the loading dock. Bay 3. Serrano says Varela comes alone or the situation changes." The orchestra swelled into something bright and completely wrong for the moment. Rowan looked up from the phone. Reyes was still watching Webb. She looked across the ballroom toward the east wall, toward the service door, toward the kitchen corridor that connected to the loading dock. Bay 3. She knew Bay 3. She'd signed manifests for Bay 3. She knew the layout, the receiving area, the freight containers, the side access that connected to the building's north exit. She knew the camera coverage on the dock approach, and she knew the one angle where the coverage dropped. She knew exactly how to get there without being seen. She looked at Reyes. She thought about what Dominic had said. "You tell him where. You do not engage directly." She thought about Eli. She put her hand on Reyes's shoulder and he turned, and she held up the phone so he could read the message, and she watched his face process it. And before he could say anything, she said, very quietly, directly into his ear so the orchestra covered it completely, "Get to Dominic. Tell him Bay 3. Tell him to come through the east corridor, not the loading dock approach. The approach is watched. The east corridor connects at the back of Bay 3, and it's not on their sight lines." Reyes looked at her. "Go," she said. Varela said, "I know what he said." She held Reyes's gaze. "Tell him east corridor, Bay 3. Tell him I'm already there." She turned and moved along the wall toward the service door before Reyes could stop her, and she went through it into the kitchen corridor, and the noise of the ballroom cut off behind her like a door closing on another world. And ahead of her, the corridor was bright and industrial, and smelled like industrial cleaning solution and prep kitchen heat. And at the far end of it, the loading dock door stood partly open, and from somewhere beyond it, she could hear, very faintly, the sound of a child's voice. She walked toward it. Her shoes were quiet on the concrete. Her breathing was controlled. In for 4 counts, out for 4, the way she'd learned to manage it in the early years of being alone and afraid, and having no option but to continue. She pressed herself against the corridor wall at the last door and looked through the gap. Bay 3 was large. Freight containers lined the back wall, 2 of them, and between them was the container that hadn't been on the manifest. Open now, the doors pushed wide, and standing in front of it were 2 men in dark clothing, and between them, seated on a packing crate with his backpack still on his back, was Eli. He wasn't crying. That was the first thing she registered. He wasn't crying, and he wasn't curled in on himself. He was sitting upright on the packing crate with his hands on his knees, and his face set in an expression of absolute determined composure that was so precisely like his father's that it moved through her like a blade. The second thing she registered was that Eli's eyes found the gap in the door and found her face in the same instant, with the accuracy of a child who had been watching every entrance since the moment he'd arrived in this space. He looked at her. He didn't move. He didn't signal. He just looked at her with those dark eyes and held completely still. And she understood that he was doing it deliberately, holding still so the men beside him wouldn't follow his eyeline. 6 years old. She pressed back against the wall outside the door and took one breath and thought about the angle to the two men and the distance to Eli and the back access that Dominic would be coming through if Reyes had gotten to him in time. And she thought about the manifest container and what Serrano had put inside a freight container 2 days ago in a hotel loading dock. And she thought about Bay 3's camera blind spot. And she thought about the fact that she was a single mother who worked 2 jobs and drove a car with a check engine light and had a leak above her bedroom closet. And she was standing outside a loading dock door about to make a decision that had no version of itself that involved her staying on the safe side of it. She pushed the door open and walked in. Both men turned. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out steady. "I'm his mother." The man on the left, older, heavier, the particular build of someone whose job was physical containment, moved toward her immediately. The man on the right stayed by Eli. He reached into his jacket. "Nobody called for you," the man on the left said. "I called for myself." She kept her eyes on Eli. "Eli, come here." "He stays," the man on the left said. "Mama," Eli said. He hadn't moved. His voice was even. She would spend a long time afterward thinking about how even his voice was. "I know," she said. "Come here anyway." The man on the left reached her. She had about 1 second before the physical reality of the situation resolved itself in the worst available direction, and she used that second by doing the only thing she had available to her. She stepped directly into him, inside the arm he was extending, and drove her elbow upward into his chin with the full momentum of her body weight behind it. It was not a trained strike. It was not precise. It connected with the side of his face rather than the point of his jaw, and it hurt her elbow badly, and it did not drop him. But it surprised him, which was different. He grabbed her arm. She went with the grab rather than against it, spinning into it the way momentum naturally wanted to go. And for 2 seconds they were locked together and she was losing. There was no version of this where she was winning. She was a receptionist, not a fighter, and he outweighed her by 80 pounds and her elbow was radiating pain up into her shoulder. Then the back access door came open, and Dominic came through it. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not something Rowan was able to reconstruct clearly afterward. It was speed and sound and the specific violence of a small enclosed space, the man holding her releasing her to respond to the larger threat, her hitting the floor on her hands and knees and staying low, the sound of impact from somewhere above her that she felt in the concrete, Eli's voice saying her name once, sharp and immediate, and her looking up and finding him still on the packing crate with the second man. And Dominic's voice, cracked through with something she had never heard in it before. Not in any version of him she'd known, not in 6 years ago or 6 days ago or 6 hours ago. "Get away from him." 3 words, barely above normal volume, completely without give. The man by Eli looked from Dominic to the floor where his partner was no longer standing and made the calculation available to him and stepped back from the crate. Eli slid off the crate and crossed the floor and hit Rowan at a full run, and she caught him and went down on one knee with the impact and held on, his backpack pressing into her arms, his face pressed against her neck, and he was shaking. Finally, now that the moment had resolved enough to be survived, he was shaking. "I'm here," she said. "I've got you." She looked up. Dominic was standing in the middle of Bay 3. The man who'd been holding her was on the floor. The second man was against the far wall with 2 of Dominic's people on either side of him, materialized from the east corridor. Dominic was breathing hard. She could see it in the movement of his chest, the way his coat was moving, the careful, controlled effort of bringing the respiration back down. There was blood on his hands, not the thin line from the cut on his jaw. Something more. He looked at Eli first, then he looked at her. She looked back at him. Somewhere in the building above them, she could still hear the orchestra, and the sound of it was so completely disconnected from the loading dock and the freight container and the 2 men and the blood on Dominic's hands that it almost made her laugh, and she pressed her face briefly into Eli's hair instead and held on tighter. "Serrano," she said. "Lobby," Dominic said. "Reyes has him." "Has him?" "He came himself. He wanted to watch it." Something moved across Dominic's expression. Not satisfaction, not the cold pleasure of a man who has won, but something exhausted and resolute and particular to someone who has been doing this long enough to know what winning costs. He came to watch, and Reyes was in the lobby when he arrived. She looked at him. "It's over," he said. Eli's breathing was slowing against her neck. The shaking was subsiding by increments. She thought about the gala upstairs, the orchestra, 200 guests in cream and gold who had heard nothing, who were moving through their evening with no idea that the building they were in had just gone through something beneath them. She thought about the envelope at her building manager's office with the instructions for Eli, and about Sable, and about the check engine light on her car. She thought about how strange it was that all of that still existed, that the ordinary ongoing fact of her life was still sitting out there waiting. She pressed her palm flat against Eli's back and felt his breathing and looked at Dominic across the loading dock. He was looking at her with an expression she'd spent a week failing to name, and standing in Bay 3 of the Alderton Grand's loading dock with blood on his hands and the orchestra playing somewhere above them, she finally understood what it was. It was the look of a man who has been running a very long calculation and has finally, at significant cost, arrived at the answer. And the answer is standing in front of him, and he doesn't know yet whether he's allowed to keep it. Dominic took the call in the loading dock with Eli still 20 feet away, sitting on the packing crate again now, not because anyone had told him to, but because the boy had apparently decided that the crate was his position and he was staying in it until someone gave him a clear reason to leave. Rowan was beside him with her hand on his back. She watched Dominic take the call, and she watched his face during it, and she learned a few things from the watching. She learned that Serrano was in custody. Not Dominic's custody, federal. 2 agents who had been running a separate surveillance operation on the Serrano faction's movements in the city had been outside the Alderton when the evening's events had accelerated, and when Reyes had walked Serrano out through the side entrance in the particular posture of a man being moved rather than moving, they had been there to receive him. She learned, from the way Dominic stood during that part of the call, that this was not entirely unexpected, that there had been a parallel conversation happening in the background of the last 72 hours that he hadn't mentioned to her. She learned, from the way he ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone at his side before turning, that the federal involvement was something he had facilitated, not been caught by. Facilitated. He turned and walked back toward her. "The federal agents outside," she said. "Yes." "You knew they were there." "Since Tuesday." She looked at him. "You made a deal." "I provided information," he said. "Serrano's network, his operations in 4 cities, his financial structure, in exchange for certain considerations regarding my own situation." "What considerations?" He held her gaze. "That's a longer conversation." "I have time." Not tonight." He looked at Eli. The boy was watching him with the focused attention he brought to things that were still being decided. "Tonight we need to get him somewhere clean and quiet." Rowan looked at her son. His backpack was still on. His shoelace on the left foot had come undone at some point during the evening and was trailing on the concrete. She reached down and tied it without thinking, the automatic action of a mother whose hands knew the task before the brain issued the instruction, and when she straightened, Eli was still looking at Dominic. "Are you hurt?" Eli asked him. Dominic looked at his own hands. The blood had dried to a dark rust color at the knuckles. "No," he said. Eli considered this assessment with visible skepticism, but didn't argue. "Let's go," Rowan said. They went to a property Dominic kept under a corporate name 20 minutes from the hotel. A house in a residential neighborhood, ordinary looking, the kind of place that didn't announce itself. 2 of his people were already there, the lights were on. Someone had put food on the kitchen counter, the kind of food that required no preparation. Bread, cheese, fruit, a container of soup that was still warm. Eli ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had been running on adrenaline for 3 hours and had now arrived somewhere that felt, provisionally, like it might be safe. He ate soup and didn't talk, and then put his head on Rowan's shoulder at the kitchen table and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She carried him to the bedroom Dominic's people had prepared and set him down and took off his shoes and pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him. The backpack was at the foot of the bed. His left shoelace was still slightly loose from her hasty knot in the loading dock. She considered retying it and decided to let him sleep. She went back to the kitchen. Dominic was at the counter with a glass of water and the particular posture of someone whose body has finished the work and is now in the process of accounting for the cost. He'd cleaned his hands. The cut on his jaw had been looked at by one of his people. Butterfly closure. Nothing that needed more. He looked like a man who had been through something and was still inside it, which was accurate. She sat at the kitchen table. "Tell me about the deal," she said. He turned and leaned against the counter. He was quiet for a moment, organizing it. "I've been in conversation with a federal task force for 7 months," he said. "Not because they had leverage, because I went to them." She absorbed this. "Why?" she said. "Because I've been trying to find a way out of my organization for 3 years, and there isn't one from the inside." He looked at the glass in his hand. "The structure doesn't allow for retirement. You know too much. You have too many relationships. You represent too much accumulated liability for the people below you. The only exits are death or federal cooperation." "You chose cooperation." "I chose my son," he said, "before I knew he existed." He looked at her. "I was already in the process. When I walked into that hotel and saw you standing at the desk, I was already 4 months into the cooperation agreement. I was in this city because the task force needed me present for a Serrano operation that had been building for a year." She sat with this. "The convoy," she said. "The presidential suite. That wasn't cover?" "It was cover. I needed to look like I was here for standard organizational business. Serrano needed to believe I was a legitimate target, someone worth moving against." He set the glass down. "What I didn't anticipate was you being in that building. Or Eli. Or Eli." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the low movement of one of his people doing a perimeter check, a door opening and closing. "The considerations," she said, "in the agreement, what are they?" "Witness protection, optionally, immunity for cooperation, dissolution of charges related to the organization's operations in which I can demonstrate I acted under structural coercion." He paused. "And a clause negotiated in the last 72 hours that covers 2 additional civilians connected to my case." She looked at him. "You added us," she said. "I added you before I even knew about Eli," he said. "I added you Wednesday night after I checked in and went upstairs and sat in that suite and understood that whatever was going to happen next, you were going to be in the radius of it because Serrano was already watching and he was going to figure out that you mattered." He held her gaze. "I didn't ask your permission. I know that." "No," she said, "you didn't. I'm telling you now." She looked at the table surface, the grain of it, the ordinary domestic fact of wood and light, and a bowl of fruit and a boy asleep down the hallway. "What does your life look like?" she said. "After." "Smaller," he said. "Quieter. The task force wants relocation, at least initially, a new structure, no organizational connections." He was quiet for a moment. "I have money that's clean, returns on legitimate holdings, accumulated before the cooperation started. Enough to build something. Something. Something that isn't what I built before." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression she'd finally named in the loading dock, the one she'd spent a week failing to find language for. It was still there, and it was still carrying the same weight. The weight of a man who has arrived at an answer and doesn't know yet if he's allowed to keep it. "I'm not making a decision tonight," she said. "I know. I'm not making a decision this week. I know that too." "You missed 6 years," she said. "I'm not going to pretend that's recoverable in a hotel and a loading dock and a house in a neighborhood I don't know." She held his gaze. "That's not me closing the door. That's me telling you the truth." "I know what the truth sounds like from you," he said. "I'll take it." She got up and went to check on Eli. "Am I right?" The next 3 months were not a story. They were work. The unglamorous, incremental, frequently frustrating work of dismantling one life while another one was still being designed. The federal process was exactly as complicated as Dominic had described, and more. There were interviews, documentation reviews, meetings in rooms with no windows where people in suits asked the same questions in different configurations and wrote things down without indicating what the writing meant. Rowan was present for the portions that concerned her directly. She answered questions with the precision she brought to everything and signed things she'd had a lawyer review first. A lawyer she'd found herself, not through Dominic's connections, which she'd stated as a condition before the first meeting and which had been accepted without argument. Eli went back to school. Sable watched him on the days Rowan was in those windowless rooms. His teacher sent a note home in the second week saying he'd been quieter than usual, but was doing fine academically and had made a friend who also liked building things. Rowan read the note 3 times at the kitchen table in her apartment and felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. She still had the apartment. The leak above the closet had been fixed. Dominic had sent someone while she was at a federal meeting, which she'd found out about upon returning home, and which had produced a conversation that she'd kept short and then thought about for 2 days. She couldn't decide if it was presumptuous or simply practical, and eventually concluded it was both and left it at that. She quit the diner job in the second month, not because anyone told her to, because she did the math on the federal arrangement and her savings and the business idea she'd been carrying at the back of her mind for 4 years, the one she'd never had the money or the stability or the sheer excess of bandwidth to actually pursue. She did the math, and she quit the diner, and she started making calls. The Alderton terminated her employment in the first week. Patterson had sent the letter with the kind of formal regret that meant he was deeply relieved to sever the connection, and she didn't blame him. She'd worked in that building for 4 years, and she'd missed specific things about it. The morning light through the lobby windows, Fletcher's steady presence, the satisfaction of a complex event running cleanly. She wouldn't miss the rest. Dominic relocated to a property 40 minutes outside the city that the task force had identified as suitable. He called on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The calls were short initially, logistical, about the federal process, about documentation. They got longer incrementally, the way things do when 2 people are cautiously testing the structural integrity of something they're not ready to name. He asked about Eli every call. What he was doing, what he'd said, what he'd eaten, whether the shoelace situation had been resolved. She answered him. She found, unexpectedly, that she liked answering him, that the act of describing Eli to someone who was invested in the answers was a different experience from the 6 years of describing Eli to people who were kind but fundamentally external to the matter. In the 3rd month, she took Eli to meet him at the property. She told Eli that morning in plain terms, not the full history. He was 6. There were things that would take years, and the right moments, and the accumulated trust of a relationship still being built. But the essential thing, that this man was his father, that they hadn't known each other because of complicated circumstances that were not Eli's fault, and not something Eli needed to fix, and that today they were going to spend some time together and see how it felt. Eli listened to all of this with his characteristic composure. When she finished, he said, "The man from the hotel." "Yes." "I already knew," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't know for sure," he said carefully, with the precision of a child who understands there's a difference. "But I thought probably." "How?" He considered this. "He looks at me like you look at me," he said, "like I'm the most important thing in the room." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go." The property had land around it, not extravagant, but enough for a yard and trees and the particular quality of outdoor space that a child who had spent most of his life in city apartments registered immediately. Eli walked ahead of them toward the tree line with the focused interest of someone conducting a survey. Dominic stood beside Rowan on the path and watched him. He was careful about it. She noticed that, the care he took not to crowd the boy, not to move toward him with the eager urgency of someone trying to compress a debt of time into a single afternoon. He let Eli set the pace, which was something she hadn't told him to do, and which told her something. After 20 minutes, Eli came back from the tree line and stood in front of Dominic with a small piece of bark in his hand and said, "Do you know what kind of tree that is?" Dominic looked at the bark. "Oak, I think." "It's an oak," Eli confirmed. "There are 4 of them." "Is that good?" Eli considered this seriously. "It's good for climbing," he said. "If the branches are low enough. I need to check the branches." "You can check them," Dominic said. Eli looked at him with an expression that was evaluating something specific, and then apparently arrived at a conclusion. "Do you want to come?" he said. A pause. Brief, the kind that contains a great deal. "Yes," Dominic said. Eli turned and went back toward the tree line. After a moment, Dominic followed him. Rowan stood on the path and watched them go and felt something she didn't try to name immediately, something that required room to exist before it required language. The boutique hotel was a building she'd been looking at for 2 years without being able to afford. 12 rooms, a small event space, a converted Victorian on the waterfront that had been through 3 owners in 8 years and had never quite found its version of itself. She'd walked past it on her way to the diner so many times that she'd started taking mental notes involuntarily. What she'd change about the entrance lighting, what the event space could be with the right furniture, how the water view from the upper rooms was an asset that nobody was capitalizing on. The purchase took 6 weeks of the kind of paperwork that required her lawyer to earn every dollar she was paying him. The renovation took 11 weeks after that, which was 3 weeks longer than planned, and produced the specific depth of exhaustion that comes from being simultaneously a general contractor, a designer, a small business owner, and a mother to a 6-year-old who had strong opinions about paint colors. Eli's strong opinion was that the lobby should be blue. She'd compromised on a blue-gray that the designer called coastal slate, and that Eli, upon seeing the finished result, declared acceptable. She opened on a Thursday in early November. She hadn't planned for the date to correspond to anything. It was simply when the building was ready. The fact that it was the same week of the previous year's gala, the same week that the Alderton had become something she couldn't separate from the events that had happened inside it, occurred to her the morning of the opening when she was unlocking the front door and the light was coming off the water the way November light does, flat and bright and very clean. Fletcher was there. He'd left the Alderton 2 months ago and had come on as her operations manager, a conversation that had taken exactly 12 minutes and had produced the mutual relief of 2 people who'd been hoping the other one would start it. Sable came with Eli, who was wearing a shirt that he'd buttoned crooked and had refused to have corrected on the grounds that he'd done it himself. Several people came whose lives had intersected with the previous year's events in ways that had changed the shapes of those lives, and some of them Rowan had expected, and some of them she hadn't, and all of them she was glad to see. Dominic arrived at 10:30. He came through the door without a convoy, without a security detail, wearing a coat she didn't recognize and carrying nothing. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the lobby. The coastal slate walls, the water light coming through the glass, the particular quality of a space that had been thought about carefully by someone who knew what made people feel safe and welcome. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "You built it," he said. "I built it," she said. He moved into the room and people shifted around him the way people shift around someone they don't know, and she watched him navigate it. Without the gravitational authority he'd had in the Alderton lobby that first rainy night, without the convoy and the formation and the studied arrangement of presence. Just a man in a coat moving through a crowded room toward the woman who had built it. Eli found him first. Of course he did. He came from somewhere near the event space at a run, with the particular velocity of a child who has been in a crowd for 90 minutes and is ready to locate someone specific, and he arrived at Dominic's side and stopped and looked up at him and said, without preamble, "There's a water view from room 7. It's the best one. I already looked." "Yeah?" Dominic said. "Come on." He went. Eli led him toward the staircase with the proprietary confidence of someone who had been in the building during renovation and therefore considered himself a partial authority on it, and Dominic followed him with the particular quality of attention she'd seen developing over the last 3 months. Not the performing of fatherhood, not the self-conscious effort of a man trying to do something correctly, but the genuine orientation of someone who has found a direction that makes the rest of the compass make sense. She watched them go up the stairs. Fletcher appeared at her shoulder. "Room 7 does have the best view," he said. "I know," she said. "I put him in room 7 during the paint walkthrough so he'd find it." Fletcher looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Do you want coffee?" "Yes." He went to find coffee. She stood in the lobby of the hotel she'd built and watched the November light come through the glass entrance and listened to the particular sound of a space full of people who were, collectively, having a morning that was better than average. Not dramatically better, not transformed, just the ordinary better of good coffee and a room with good light and the company of people who had come because they wanted to. Through the ceiling, she could hear Eli's footsteps, distinctive even through the floor, moving quickly in the way he moved when he was showing someone something and wanted them to keep up. She heard Dominic's footsteps, too, slower, the measured pace of someone who was following and content to follow for once in his life. Done. The federal process concluded formally in the second week of December. There was no ceremony for it. There was a document and a phone call from a woman at the task force who had the particular brisk warmth of someone who handled significant things daily and had learned to acknowledge them without dwelling, and then there was an ordinary Tuesday morning that was different from the previous Tuesday morning only in the ways that Rowan could feel and couldn't entirely articulate. She drove to Dominic's property that afternoon. Not with Eli. Eli was in school, where he'd been for 3 months now, with the settled continuity of a child whose life had found a rhythm he could rely on. She drove alone. He was outside when she arrived, in the yard, doing something with a section of fence that had been coming loose since summer. He saw her car and set down what he was holding and watched her park. She got out and walked toward him. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for months, with that expression she'd named in the loading dock and had been living alongside ever since. The answer that didn't yet know if it was allowed to stay. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What does that feel like?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the woman who had left a city in the dark 6 years ago with $400 and a contact number, and the particular terror of someone who has made a large, irreversible choice and is now living at full speed inside its consequences. She thought about the apartment above the dry cleaning shop, and the diner job, and Patricia the nurse, and the February snowstorm, and the check engine light, and the leak above the closet, and the 4 years of walking into the Alderton every morning before sunrise and unlocking the front doors. She thought about the loading dock and Eli on the packing crate with his backpack and his undone shoelace, and his eyes finding her face in the gap of the door and going still, holding the information in his body until she could act on it. She thought about room 7 and the water view and Eli's crooked buttons and Fletcher's coffee and the coastal slate walls. Like something finished, she said, and something else starting. He looked at her. She looked back. The fence post he'd been working on was leaning slightly to the left, and the yard needed the work that yards need in December, and beyond the tree line the afternoon light was doing what November light does at the edges of the day, going gold and low and brief. She noted all of this the way she noted everything, precisely, without sentiment, because the world was made of details, and you either paid attention to them or you didn't, and she had always paid attention. "I want to have dinner," she said. "The 3 of us. Not at the hotel, not at a property, at a restaurant. Like people." The corner of his mouth moved. "Like people," he said. "Eli picks the restaurant. Fair warning. His criteria involve whether they have a good kind of bread. He will ask about the bread before we sit down." "That's reasonable." "He gets it from me," she said. "I know," he said. "I've watched you check the bread." She hadn't known he'd noticed that. The fact that he had moved through her simply, without drama, the way the right details always did. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. She turned and walked back to her car. Behind her, she heard him pick up the tool he'd set down and go back to the fence, and the sound of it, the ordinary physical sound of a person doing a necessary task in a yard on a Tuesday afternoon, was so completely different from every version of him she'd known or feared or run from that she sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine and let it settle. Outside the glass, the yard was ordinary, the fence, the trees, the December light pulling toward dark at the edges of the afternoon. She started the car and drove back toward the city, toward the hotel with its coastal slate walls and its water view and its 12 rooms, toward the school where Eli was in the last hour of his day, probably already thinking about what he was going to tell her when she picked him up, toward the ordinary Thursday and Friday that were waiting on the other side of this Tuesday, like any other days that haven't happened yet. She drove through the city, and the city went about its business around her, indifferent and continuous and entirely uninterested in what she had survived to arrive in it. That was fine. She was done needing the city to know. She was done needing most things she'd spent 6 years needing: the distance, the silence, the sealed compartments, the envelope at the building manager's office that she'd retrieved last week and taken home and sat with for a long time at the kitchen table before folding it and putting it somewhere she hoped to never need again. She wasn't the same woman who'd written that envelope. She wasn't the woman who'd left in the dark either, or the one who'd stood at the Alderton desk on a rainy Tuesday night and felt the blood leave her face. She was what those women had become after everything that had happened to them and everything they'd chosen and everything they'd paid. She was Rowan Hale, who had built a hotel by a river. She was Eli's mother, who tied his shoelaces and argued about paint colors and had long since stopped being surprised by his capacity to know things she hadn't told him. And she was, cautiously and without promises, and with the full knowledge of every reason caution was warranted, the woman who had said Friday. That was enough. That was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly enough.